So the COVID school closures were a catastrophe, right? Shutting down K through 12 education permanently hobbled America's youth, and we're going to be suffering the economic repercussions for decades to come. I mean, this is the settled truth among talking heads. This is the new gospel. But I wonder what Bryan Caplan would make of this. He's an economist at George Mason University and the author of The Case Against Education.
People barely learn anything in most of their classes. The main reason most people are trying is just so they can go to college where they will also not learn very much.
Let's just say he does think the pandemic revealed the primary purpose schools serve, and it is not education. So your book, The Case Against Education, though, essentially is saying, okay, everyone who's been through high school thinks that this is a soul-crushing, boring, useless waste of time. Here's 300 pages of detailed economic analysis proving that your instinct is correct, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of evidence on how little people actually learn in high school. And the answer is, yeah, very little. Essentially, here's the best way of thinking about it. For literacy and numeracy, here we can say that at least it is hard to disprove the view that high school improves you moderately. And for skills like that, a modern improvement could actually have a lot of value.
Right.
Because going from can't read and write at all to being able to read and write so, that matters a lot for your future, for the job you can do, and just for your quality of life. But what I can say is that for all other subjects other than literacy and numeracy, we have very good evidence that essentially most people really learn nothing. What is it that people study in high school that they still know when they're adults? Which is obviously supposed to be the point. It's not just that you know more on test day. It's supposed to be that you actually have the information with you for later in life that you could use at some point, supposedly. Right? And that's where I go over all of the things other than literacy and numeracy that schools purport to teach. So science, history, civics, foreign language, things that people often spend 4 years, 3 years working on. And for all of these things, what I'll say is essentially what people know is a rounding error. A good way of thinking about it is that for most of these subjects, just imagine the easiest conceivable tests that you could give someone. Things like, does the Earth revolve around the sun or the sun revolve around the Earth? That's an actual question from one of these tests that have been given to American adults. So just imagine the very easiest possible questions, or like, what century did the Civil War happen in? Stuff that is so easy.
Right.
And give people a test of that. Basically, American adults who only finish high school would be lucky to get half right. Well, here's the thing. Look, if someone knew only half their letters, would you say, what do you call them?
Yeah.
I call them illiterate, because you cannot read if you only know half the letters. Yeah. If someone doesn't know what century the Civil War was fought in, you just don't understand American history at all. If you don't understand that every state has 2 senators, you don't understand U.S. politics at all. Yeah. You're just completely confused, totally out to lunch. Remember, there are no jobs for people who know half of basic science. You cannot possibly do that. And then furthermore, on top of all this, there is the idea, well, but we do this so that people get a taste of it and then maybe they'll go and become scientists. Look, we know very early on who has any prospect of becoming a scientist. At least we can say a lot of people, it's just no possibility.
Right.
So,
by 7th grade? How early do you think you know?
Yeah, I think you say, look, if you are in the bottom half of math in 7th grade, then your odds that you will ever actually be a working scientist is 1 in 10,000. It's really that low.
It's like a lot of academic ability in terms of interest and also just raw processing power is built into the chromosomes. And the 4 years you spend in high school is a lot of wasteful theatrics. That's pretending as if that stuff is more pliable than it actually is.
That's right.
I 100% agree with you. But when you articulate that to the people that are the agents of educational romanticism, have you ever received anything remotely resembling a good response?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think I have a better response than they have.
Right.
Namely, it is not true that most students cannot be taught this stuff. Most can be. It's a question of what would it take to do it. Foreign languages. People learn foreign languages. It really happens. But you don't do it the way that you do it in high school, where you go to a class these days maybe only go 2 or 3 times a week for 90 minutes and then do a little homework. Like, that is not the way you learn a foreign language. What you need to do to learn a foreign language is probably about 10 times the time investment that they're doing.
Right.
So I'm not going to say that students can't do it. I'm saying that if you really want it to happen, you would have to multiply what you're doing by a factor of 10, not 10%. Multiply it tenfold, and then I think you would get the results. Then the question is just like, is it really worth going and making the only thing this person does learning Spanish for the next 4 years so that they can learn it? And that's where I think that is the reasonable question. So honestly, I homeschooled my older sons, and I told them, look, there's no way we can get out of learning a foreign language. And furthermore, no one's going to believe me when you apply to college if I just say, oh, they're great. We've got to do some standardized tests, which means really have to learn it. Now, my sons then, they were very resentful, very bitter about this for a few months. But then they really did get over the hump where they started to like it. Then they did something very extreme. It was, okay, we're only going to speak Spanish to each other. And they did a lot of other things. We're going to just watching a ton of movies only in Spanish. We're going to turn off the subtitles. So they put in what I really think is at least 10 times the effort that most students would have done, that they would have done if they'd been in regular high school, and now they're fluent. It can be done.
Wow.
And again, the same goes for math. I think that if you really were to say, all right, from now on, we're not doing an hour of math a day, we're doing 10 hours of math a day. If you were willing to do that, which of course means cutting out a ton of other stuff, then I think you could get people that right now are quite mediocre at math and make them good. It's just a question of, is it worth it to go and make one thing the entire basis of your life when you're that age and you don't like it?
Well, but you're right. It's like it's educational romanticism, but then it's like half-assed in its execution, right?
Yes,
so it's we're going to do 3 90-minute blocks of Spanish every week because we believe that learning a foreign language is part of this majestic liberal arts that we're going to douse you with.
Yep.
So it's
more of a spritz, really.
Right.
Okay, there. Vaya con Dios.
Right, but it's only. If school is mostly a waste of time and money, and students spend most of the time bored or subjected to punishing Hobbesian social dynamics of a 17-year-old Homo sapien, right? Why weren't the COVID school closures more popular? Or why is it that now there's a bipartisan consensus that the school closures were an apocalypse?
Well, fantastic question. This comes down to what is the one thing that K through 12 does for Americans that is indisputable and very helpful, and that is daycare. Daycare, of course. They had one real job, right? Just to go and warehouse kids during the day so parents can live their lives. During COVID, a lot of schools, like in my area for over a year, they just said, hey, we just don't provide this anymore. We give Zoom school. This is where you realize, wow, the one thing that you did that was definitely useful you don't do anymore.
Yeah.
And then you switch over to to Zoom school where, at best, the parent has to go and be an unpaid employee of the school and provide discipline. A crazy system.
Yeah.
So I'll say it's obvious why parents were really unhappy during the COVID
Right.
school closures. It's also quite remarkable that almost all private schools reopened because they're paying customers. They're not going to pay $30,000 a year for freaking Zoom school. They want the daycare. That is the most undeniable, useful thing that school does.
But then when you see these kind of breathless denunciations of the school closures that are backed up by data related to learning losses, where they say, well, kids fell X grades behind over the last 18 months. Is that data reliable, or is it mostly just a smokescreen for people to come up with like an ex post justification for getting their kids back in daycare, you know?
My guess is that it's pretty reliable. Because the reality is that for most of these subjects, if you would come back 15 years later, they would have lost almost everything either way. So it's really just a difference of it's a short run difference, most likely. Of course, we can't be absolutely sure. But I think that the most reasonable view is the learning loss the kids have is short run, and they will, in fact, catch up to where they would have been otherwise within a few years.
What do you make of the idea, though, that the process of testing and making you memorize and synthesize facts and figures, okay, 6 months after the test, you might have forgotten those specific facts and figures, but we're training your mind muscles, right? We're training some sort of cognitive ability that sticks around. Those muscles stick around, even if the specific kind of things that you put in them to train disappeared. You know what I mean?
Initially, that's a very plausible story. However, it's one that we can test, and it has been tested. There's a field called educational psychology. About 100 years ago, there was a psychologist named Thorndike who was sick of hearing everyone say how everyone has to learn Latin because it builds mental muscles and teaches logic. It's the most logical of all languages. So he actually did an early experiment and said, no, it doesn't look like teaching Latin does anything other than increase knowledge of Latin, if that. Now, since then, there's been 100 years of research on all these kinds of things that would go under the heading of learning how to learn or critical thinking, building mental muscles. This literature is, in the end, ultra pessimistic. Right? The people that work in this area, it's important to understand, one does not go into educational psychology thinking that you were going to show that this kind of thing does not happen.
Yeah, they want it to happen. They want it to work.
They definitely wanted to find it. And yet, it is very standard for people in this literature to go and say, gee, when I was young, I was sure I could find these results. I was sure other people were wrong. And I've worked on this for years, and now I realize this is not actually how learning works. The way that learning works is actually highly specific. Furthermore, going back to that analogy of the muscles, I love this analogy because, wait a second, well, how do physical muscles work? If you go and pump a lot of iron for a month, what happens to your body? Yeah, all right, you get bigger muscles. And then what happens if you stop doing it? A couple months later, you are right back where you freaking started. That is how physical muscles worked. Physical muscles work. So if you think of mental muscles as being like physical muscles, then actually you should believe exactly what I'm telling you, namely that if you don't use it, you lose it. I mean, essentially, here's the real story. All right, teachers measure one thing, and those results are quite disappointing. And then what do they say? Well, this other thing that we don't measure at all, we did great on that, trust me. All right, so we measured, we taught you the Civil War, and when 6 months later we come back and you barely know anything about the Civil War. How can I justify my existence? Well, let's say that even though you've forgotten everything that was even tested, anything measured, that you're actually great at something that we don't measure and never plan on measuring. It's laughably convenient.
Right. So just to restate it, though, which is 10th grade Rob Montz having to slave through like grapes of wrath and doing conjunctions of Latin verbs. I'm like, this is painful and boring. I'm being told, you're building the mind muscles so that when you're the 38-year-old Rob Montz, you're going to have these elite mind muscles.
You owe it all to Steinbeck.
Right? You're saying that actually has been pretty thoroughly investigated and thoroughly debunked.
That is correct.
Right. So my 10th grade Latin teacher was lying to me, Bryan, is what you're saying.
I bet she believed it. It's just a question
I'm coming to get you, Miss Creasy. It's coming now. Do you think the thread of critical race theory in education is overblown, underblown, or properly blown?
I will say that I actually had a big conversion here since I wrote The Case Against Education. So in the case against education, there's a section called the paper tiger of political correctness. I stand by what I said in terms of the evidence, namely that at the time that I wrote, there's very little evidence that schools successfully brainwash people into left-wing zombies. Right. So at the time that I wrote, we really you can see that when by the numbers, it doesn't look like schools are all that persuasive, right? Which kind of makes sense when you remember how boring teachers are. It doesn't seem
and they're bad at teaching even basic things.
Yeah, they're bad at
teaching even basic mathematics.
Even basic things. Most human beings have a lot of trouble reading between the lines. You could have a highly biased historical curriculum, and most people won't even realize that you're trying to make them more left wing. But if you remember what I was saying about there's two reactions you can have to educational failure. One is to say, it's not worth it, let's give up. The other one is to multiply by 10 what you're doing and see if you can get results.
Interesting. And they did the other one?
Yes, I think that is what is going on with left-wing indoctrination in schools. Now, by the way, my friend Mike Humer has a great thought experiment on this, where people sometimes say, look, we're just teaching the facts. We're just teaching all of the bad things that white people have done. And what Mike Humer said, he's a philosopher, so this is a bona fide thought experiment. He said, look, imagine there was a school where all they ever did was teach true bad things that Jews had done. From the minute the school starts to the end of the day, and here's a Jew who went and mugged somebody. Here's a Jew who stole some jewelry.
Just the facts.
Here's a Jewish murderer.
Just the facts.
Right. If that was all they did, and someone accused them of being anti-Semitic, and then they said, no, it's nothing anti-Semitic, we're just describing the facts. You say, look, that is extremely misleading.
Yeah.
You are giving an ultra-selective reading the facts. So they said, look, even if every single fact that was being taught under the rubric of under what many people would call CRT, or I'll just call left-wing brainwashing, was true, it would still be a terrible and objectionable thing if there's a lot of other facts that go the other way that never get discussed, especially if you're doing emotional blackmail on children to keep them from ever saying anything else.
Yeah.